Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another Daily Maverick webinar coming to you from Johannesburg in South Africa and Ukraine and Kyiv in Ukraine. We're very grateful that you have joined us. I'm told that over 500 people from all over the world have registered for this webinar. And I think that reflects the importance of a discussion at this moment in time, at this moment in history, on Ukraine's fight for a just peace, which is the subject of this evening's discussion. My name is Mark Hayward. I'm the moderator this evening. I'm a social justice activist in South Africa, and I'm enormously grateful that we have the benefit of three people coming to us from Kyiv in the Ukraine, from the front line of this conflict to talk to us about what this war is about, what it's not about, and what a just peace must involve. I'm going to introduce them in 2 minutes, but I just want to say before I do that yesterday marked the third anniversary since the illegal invasion of parts of Ukraine, a large part of Ukraine, by Russian forces. But it's also 11 years since the beginning of Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine with the annexure of the Crimea in 2014. So this is a long, brutal conflict, costing enormously in peace, in lives. I don't think we know the numbers exactly of lives that have been lost, but on both sides, in inverted commas, there are an estimated close to 400,000 deaths. And I think that we have to remember that whilst the Ukrainian army is made up of people who are going to the front lines to defend the independence of that country, many of the people fighting from Russia are being forced to those front lines and forced into battle and to losing their lives. It's a conflict that has destabilized the world. It's further polarized the world, and it's further led to the consolidation of power blocks in the world. So it's a disastrous conflict in terms of politics and in terms of life. As I said, very grateful. Three speakers, three panelists to be part of our conversation. And let me just introduce them. They represent, I think, quite diverse perspectives and diverse experiences. First of all, Annabelle Ramirez. Good evening, Annabelle, and thank you for joining us this evening. Annabelle is actually an actress, director, and a coach, but she leads cultural diplomacy at the Ukrainian Institute for Asia, Africa, and Latin America. She founded a publishing house, and in the early months of the invasion, she worked with international journalists in the deoccupied Kyiv region. So Annabelle, we're very grateful for the work that you do and that you are here with us this evening. The second person I'd like to introduce is Irina Drobovich. Sorry for butchering your name, Irina. I got it right when we were warming up. Thanks for being with us. Irina is a civil society leader, a gender equality advocate. She co-founded an organization called the Day After Foundation that supports women's leadership and post-war recovery. She's also a national representative or consultant for UN Women in Ukraine. So bringing particularly that set of perspectives from civil society. And then our third panelist is Mr. Oleksiy Melnik. Oleksiy, thank you very much for being Oleksiy. Sorry, Oleksiy, I'm doing it to you. Must be because I'm nervous. Oleksiy, good evening. Alexei is a co-director of foreign relations and security programs at the Razumkov Center. The Razumkov Center is a non-partisan think tank research institute that specializes on issues to do with defense, foreign policy, security challenges, geopolitics, and so on. Uh, he is frequently advises the Ukrainian government and contributes to policy discussions on regional security. So Alexei brings another important perspective into this discussion. You are all very welcome. And as I said, all 500 people who are with us this evening are welcome too. There will be an opportunity in the course of this evening to ask any questions to our panelists. If you have a question, pop the question into the chat. I will see the question and I will do my best to put it to the panelists. But if this webinar is anything like other webinars, there will be more questions than time to answer them. So please forgive me in advance if we don't get to all of the questions that get posed tonight. But I wanted to start this evening's discussion just with 10 minutes, 5 minutes each, to just ask each of the panelists for some opening reflections. It's 3 years since the city that you are in this evening came under Russian attack. I'd just like to ask your personal reflections on the war, what it has meant to you, what it has meant to the country, and how you are feeling 1,000 and something days down the line. I'll start with you, Annabelle. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, dear Mark, for this introduction and for inviting us for this conversation. And thank you all the interested audience who joined us today. I guess I would start answering your questions and talking like with a little bit more of wider perspective of the question you called like what this war is all about. And it's important to underline it, I guess, in the beginning of the conversation, something that is often escaped in the conversation like this, that this war is not only the war for our territories that have been taken from us, it is also the war to keep and save our identity. So we could really tell the world who we are. So this is again one of the moments when I feel gratitude for conversations like that, because we have the chance to speak by ourselves without mediators about who we are. Because actually, to be completely like truthful about the whole situation, it's not even 11 years. It's centuries and centuries of oppression that we as country, as nation have been going through. And not to go so far in history, but to name a couple of examples from the 20th century for you, to give you this wider picture of why we are so, let's say, emotional and persistent about our fight. Pretty much the identity that is kept in the culture keeps identity, in Ukraine has been interrupted so many times. For example, in the 20th century, in the early 20s, we had a generation of artists that was called a shot generation, because we had so many young people who started to remember who they are, and they were shot, repressed, and killed by Soviet regime. In Sortis, we had a Holodomor. This is an artificial hunger imposed in Ukraine by the government of Soviet Union. We had repressions, and so many artists' voice were silenced during the Second World War, during 70s, 80s, 90s. And when we talk about this whole generations of people who were trying to keep the notion of who we are and being interrupted, it is a miracle that we actually do remember and do know what we stand for. As Ukrainians, we know our values. We know that freedom and independence means something, that it's not just a beautiful word, that this is something that is worth fighting for. And we also are, in this whole process of really constantly reminding it to ourselves, but also to the world. And we had, unfortunately, so many years of not being in touch and contact with cultures far away from us, including South Africa. And that's why it is such an honor to have finally this opportunity. And we started as country, as institutions that we represent here, as people that we are here, to contact, to exchange, in my case, in a cultural exchange, educational exchange, with artists and people from South Africa. And this brings hope to me, because one of other points that you mentioned, that this war, the war that Russia started, brought whole world into this polarization of systems. And for us, this is something very obvious. This was always a war between free people and oppressed system. So the system that is used to oppress, and winning in this war means a victory of free people, people who know, who have possibility to think independently. So I guess with this kind of broad but very specific introduction, I will give a word to my colleagues, and hope we will move on.
Thank you, Annabelle, for an excellent introduction. And I think the background helps us to understand where you are today. The history helps us to understand. I also think it helps us connect with you from South Africa, because strange though it may seem, your struggles in Ukraine for freedom and liberation from colonialism, from the Soviet Union, in a certain sense, in a different part of the world, mirror struggles that went on in Africa and in South Africa for national liberation and freedom. So down this part of the world, we know the value of freedom and democracy, and we know where you're coming and why it is so important. So thank you for painting that picture. It's very helpful. Irina, moving over to you now, just for your opening thoughts to tonight's participants.
Thank you, Mark, for outlining this set of questions. That is quite touching to answer this question, especially these days when we commemorate the third anniversary of the large-scale war that Russia has launched against Ukraine. That is the part of the 11 years war that we are ongoing in our country. Like 3 years ago, I still hear missiles exploding in the sky almost every night. That was 3 years ago. That is still ongoing. And that confirms that there is no safe space in Ukraine right now. However, we are here fighting for our identity, for our future, and for the global democracy. Like 3 years ago, I'm still the women's rights activist, but now I feel myself more empowered. Since within these 3 years, I have seen dozens of example how women lead nationally, how they are going to the international platforms advocating for Ukraine, and how they lead in the communities, keeping those who need support with support, providing the supporting the needs of the vulnerable groups, but also going to the armed forces. As you may know, we have 65,000 Ukrainian women on the front lines, and 5,000 of them are currently executing the combat tasks on the battlefield. We have women leading in providing the humanitarian support, including to the regions that are still in the occupation or have been just deliberated. We have women who support those victims of the war crimes that have been conducted by Russians during this large-scale war. Many, many of examples of the leadership make me proud of the women's movement in Ukraine that leads the efforts in withstanding the aggressor, together with the brave men who are also contributing to our victory. After 3 years of the war, I still feel myself as fragile human who believes in human rights, in democracy, and in peace. And as you, Mark, have outlined in the beginning of our conversation, defending our country is our choice. Contributing to our victory is my choice. I'm in Ukraine. What I can do the best is to invest my knowledge, my skills into preparing women leaders into building just and sustainable peace after Ukraine wins. With that aim, together with my colleagues, I have co-founded the foundation The Day After, that is providing the educational activities and the advocacy activities for Ukrainian women who would like to reflect their experience during the war and to invest this experience into building just and sustainable peace in Ukraine. I will mention here that we are not advocating for peace for any price, but we only advocate for just and sustainable peace and for women's meaningful participation in these processes. That only means that we truly believe in Ukraine's victory and we are full of hope. That's how I feel today, and we'll be happy to follow our conversation further. Thank you.
Thank you, Irina. And I must say, it's marvelous that you can still be full of hope after these 3 years, because I can't imagine what it is like to live in a city that faces regular missile attacks. I think there was a drone attack yesterday or the day before. I read somewhere as I was preparing for this webinar that children in Kyiv know the different sounds of different types of bombs that come over from Russia, and that there are, I think I read over 400,000 displaced people in your city alone. So it must take tremendous resilience. And, you've painted a picture for us because from afar we see only something very superficial. And what you've said about the role of women, we actually don't know that there are 65,000 women on the front line. Certainly I didn't know that. So thank you for adding your free voice to our understanding of the front lines. I'll come back to you in a minute. Irina mentioned not peace at any price. And you use the word just and meaningful peace. And perhaps, Alexei, that's something you could address as well in your opening comments. What is a just and meaningful peace for you? But come to that part of my question when you're ready, because I'm sure you have some opening thoughts that you want to communicate to this audience. But I think many of us would like to know what is just and what is meaningful and what is acceptable to the people of Ukraine, not what is acceptable to Vladimir Putin or to Donald Trump. But we will get there. Alexei, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Mark. And now I don't need to answer your question about my personal feeling. That's one of the questions that I usually hesitate to discuss in public. Because as a former military with 20 years of military service and the current security observer, I'm trying to look on the situation through the professional prism and then you have a slightly different picture. I would not say that it's a much better picture than for rank and file people, because sometimes you understand details and you see some trends that most of the citizens of Ukraine hopefully don't see. Yeah, 3 years is the proper moment to make assessments and draw some conclusions. And if we think about what are the results of the achievements of the two warring fighting sides, there are plenty of information, and we all know about the human cost, about economic cost, damage to Ukrainian infrastructure, and damage to the prospects of Ukraine's future developments. And this war has been fought on multiple fronts: in information, culture, religion. I mean, this is really a full-fledged war. It's not just on the front line. If we just try to understand the Russian motives of Russian achievements, what Vladimir Putin or Russia as the country have achieved during the 3 years: occupied territories of Ukraine. Yeah, it looks like a great achievement measured in thousands of square kilometers, but it's devastated land. And most of the people that lived on these territories that were kind of liberated by Russians were Russia speakers. So I think that at the end of the third full-scale invasion, Vladimir Putin has very little to report as the achievements. Of course, Ukrainian losses are enormous comparing to Russian losses. I'm not talking about like casualties or money wasted for fighting the war, but what Ukraine achieved, that Ukraine still exists, and Ukraine still struggles, and Ukraine is still confident, and Ukraine has hundreds of dozens of partners, international partners, and hundreds of nations that support Ukraine. And I think it's a great achievement despite all the problems that we've been experiencing. So what is the current assessment of the situation in general? More than 1.5 years ago, the war approached its phase of the war of attrition. This is a positioning fighting, and despite like daily reports of more square kilometers occupied by Russian forces or some small villages, actually there is no operational breakthrough, and there is no prospects for Russia to achieve its strategic objectives. Both sides are exhausted, but still fighting and aim to achieve their objectives militarily. And right now, when we have this meeting, I think that the war entered a very critical moment and maybe crucial moment. And we know why, because of the different role being played by one of Ukrainian key partner that we now have some doubts whether it is Ukrainian partner or becoming already a Russian partner. I mean the new American administration, because Ukraine now finds itself under double pressure from Moscow and from Washington. But as I mentioned, it is not like 1938 Munich situation with Czechoslovakia, because Ukraine have plenty of true partners, European partners, and Ukraine is not ready to surrender. And as Irina mentioned, Ukrainians are eager to achieve peace. We are really tired, exhausted and we want peace, but not peace at any price. And Razumkov Center conducts regular public opinion polls. So there is a growing demand for peace negotiations, but at the same time, people still confident that there cannot be peace at any price. There are some probably general consensus in the Ukrainian society that compromises like Ukrainian territory or Ukrainian future security guarantees cannot be compromised. And to sum up, this is a real critical moment, and there is much more at stake, not just Ukrainian territories and NATO membership, because now we are approaching a moment when Europe in general and the rest of the world face very hard choice, either to let the Russian aggressor to escape unpunished or to achieve what we call just and long-lasting peace by making an aggressor to accept that this is not something that could be acceptable in the current war. So that's what we see as our objective, and that what we see as the possible compromises or the level of compromises that Ukraine can accept.
Thank you, Alexei. Very sobering and important points. I'm going to go back to Annabelle in a minute, but I just want to ask you one question because it's kind of on topic with what you've just been saying. We got a question from Louis Ebner, who's actually from California in the States, who's watching. And he says, could we get the panel's reaction to yesterday's vote in the UN, and particular to the apparent shift in UN policy? And it relates to your point, I think, Alexei, about uncertainty, whether, to quote you, whether the USA is a Ukrainian partner or a Russian partner at this stage. Alexei, would you just comment, what's your response to how the US behaved in the UN General Assembly yesterday?
Yeah, thank you. And I think Louis raised very important question, because we heard dozens of statements, shocking statements coming from Donald Trump personally and from officials that blaming Ukraine for starting this war, avoiding to call Vladimir Putin an aggressor or a dictator, and so on and so forth. But now we see some real actions, like the voting and the opposition actually to Ukrainian draft prepared by other UN members to support Ukraine and to say what Russia is still an aggressor, and instead proposing an alternative declaration or resolution, which actually so neutral, so nice, and that's I mean makes us even more worried, because now we see that the current new American administration is making transition from statements, confusing and shocking statements, to practical, damaging practical actions. That's a very worrying situation.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that question. Just read one quick comment from Evelyn. Hello from South Africa. As a mother of a son enlisted, this is so personal for me. My son messaged me, this war is breaking his brain after 2.5 years in service. So that's the pain people are feeling. Nicola says, Van Rijn, the protest I attended on Friday, one of the chants was occupation is not peace. Again, just expressions, important expressions of sentiment. Annabelle, I want to come back to you, and then I'll come to Irina again. Annabelle, you are a young person in Ukraine. who's had your kind of youth broken by the horror of this war, and I would imagine your life interrupted, professional life interrupted, and so on. As I said at the outset, you're an activist and a cultural diplomat and an actress. But what's your vision for a free and peaceful Ukraine? What would you like Ukraine to look like? Say we get a just peace. What society do you and the people of Ukraine want to build? If you can just answer that, and then I have a question to Irina, which is probably more about the society you don't want to continue to experience. But Annabelle, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I will answer this question, I guess, taking off also from the comment onto um, our attitude and personal attitude, and also mood that we have here about the voting of yesterday. And I guess this is something that is very important to constantly remind that we are not like in between. We have this pressure, yes, from two big powers on us, but this doesn't make us voiceless in this situation. So this is something that mentioning at the beginning was explaining why uh, gives us like this power to speak up and to actually have hope, as Irina said in the beginning, that we are a pretty hopeful society, exactly because we've been constantly, let's say, played with by big powers, so we don't rely that much on them. That's what Alexis said is very important. We have more partners, and we are willing to have even more partners around the world who understand why it's crucial to fight and support us. And this is something that is also constantly like under evaluated, as for my opinion, the power of narratives, because this is something that is confusing, yeah, when we hear that United States doesn't support Ukraine anymore or don't want to, or like we immediately as people reading news, we feel discomfort, we feel afraid, we feel helpless. And when we start to feeling that, there is like a pause in our action. We don't know what else we can do, and it comes also because we think that the war is being won by armies fighting. And in Ukraine, what we learned, and as a young person that I guess didn't have to learn this when I was like young, but I learned that a war, though it is a military conflict, it is something that activates all the society. So the only possibility we can stand for a huge army is actually that we are not only relying on our partners of big powers or on our soldiers on the front line. We rely on ourselves and on what else can we do, what choices can we make to support, the process of winning. And this is exactly how I want to see my country in future, and this is how I want to see the world in future, when every person understands the responsibility to take an action, to take a decision, to make an action, because we cannot just rely on and governments decisions that other people make for us. It is important for us to make decisions and to understand on what is the base of the decisions. And I see that as something hopeful in my society, because when I was growing up, it was much of like there were less people ready to take their own decisions for their lives, because this is something that is a sad heritage of living in an oppressed country. Because what aggressor and oppressor does to you is that it tells you that we can decide for your life. If you want it or if you don't, we will decide. We are this people who will choose what you will eat, what you will learn, what information
Language
you
you speak,
speak,
yeah.
speak. And it takes so much of a courage and actually knowledge and critical thinking and bravery to go out of this oppressive system inside your mind. So, and I saw this huge change. I saw how many people were becoming more active in that. And so, when also people ask me like how can we help Ukraine if we don't have, I don't know, money for donation or influence, like you always have this possibility to go out of this oppressive system inside your mind and just start like speaking up for freedom and independence, really wanting this independence, because this is the key. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Again, just affirming what you've said. I mean, I remember, I think probably 2 years ago or something, when a group of people from Ukraine visited South Africa, I was amazed at the stories that came from civil society organizations about the efforts of civil society up to 2014 and beyond, after 2004, to rebuild Ukraine, to fight against corruption, to create a government where there was accountability and proper freedom and proper equality of opportunity. Again, it's a problem. So we sit at different ends of the world, but sometimes we're even in neighboring countries and we don't actually understand what's going on under the surface, just underneath the surface of the real people's struggle for quality life and dignity and freedom. And I think you've given us a bit of a feeling about that. Irina, moving on from there, I have two questions. I had one, but now I'm going to throw in a second question. I mean, there's a lot of disinformation, and Vladimir Putin said he had to invade because this was in some ways, a war to liberate Ukraine from Nazification, and he said that this is not a war against the civilians of Ukraine. Can you just say a little bit about what's happened to human rights in Ukraine under, the invasion? I've heard stories about children being abducted, taken away to Russia. I think that issue is still not resolved. And then if you can just finish this part of your comment, because there's a question from Johan Murray. Has President Zelensky still got his country's backing, contrary to Trump's claims? That's been one of the things that's been floated recently, that I think it was said that only 4% of people in Ukraine support President Zelensky. And maybe, Alexei, you will also come to that question. But Irina, back into your court.
Thank you, Mark. I will try to combine the set of facts. Since you have started with disinformation challenge, checking the facts, leaning on the data, and also it's important. It's also important to invite Ukrainians to any platforms internationally. So we are telling you our stories. We give you facts, but not somebody tells that they are truth about the world. In time when the world is falling apart, only those facts and people who live through that moments to confirm these facts makes the difference and makes sense. What is happening with the human rights during the war is just part of evil. We have, as reported recently, we have over 150,000 children illegally deported to Russia. it just officially said, but the real numbers could be more and more. We have over
Sorry,
one.
can I just interrupt? 150,000.
Yes, that was reported by the Office of the President, by the special envoy or commissioner on children's rights.
Yeah.
The same data was like 1.5 million of children still remain in occupation. We couldn't forget that over 18% of Ukrainian territory is still under occupation. Correct me, colleagues, if I'm wrong with this precise data, but that's what I have, what I'm leaning on from the official resources. Since I'm, as a women's rights activist, I'm working with the women's rights organization who are working with victims of the war crimes. We have numerous numbers of sexual crimes that is connected with the war. And those victims, on the one hand, remain unseen, since this trauma is very, very hard. And to overcome these challenges is really, it takes really the strength to do that. But again, on the other hand, we have brilliant civil society organizations, as you, Mark, have mentioned, that support those women to go through their pain and to at least make the testimony, at least to document the war crimes. So the perpetrator will be punished and justice will come, sometime will come back to those people specifically and to the country as a whole. We also have the people who remain in occupation. And it's a brilliant question that was put, not question, the brilliant remark that was put from one of our participants who has participated at the rally. Occupation is not peace. The human rights violations that are going on the occupied territories are enormously hard. I'm just back from Warsaw from the meeting of the Women Leaders Coalition for Future, and I met there the woman who was in the captivity for 3 years. She is already back, and she is a strong advocate for those people who remain in occupation and who suffer as much or even more that she suffered. So that's the few numbers that I put here. But what you have, but I will be back to the combating disinformation that you have highlighted right in the beginning of the question. Again, when we hear 4% from President Trump, we just make the fact check and lean on the data that provide us from the Razumkov Center or from other well-known and respected centers that give another data that reach over 50% of support. That means that this fact-checking should be at every step, just to make sure that decisions that we make to support Ukrainians or not are based on that facts. And it is worth it to support us, since we are on this front line for fighting for democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now back to Alexei. Alexei, let's just stick with President Zelensky. Somebody says that he thinks Zelensky is Anand, is the single biggest obstacle to peace in Ukraine. He says, why has it taken him this long to say he wants peace? I think there's an obvious answer to that, but I want that answer from a person in Kyiv, like yourself, from a person in Ukraine. So could you address that? And can you just link it? There's another question about are Ukrainian population ready to accept that they may well lose parts of the country now held by Russia. I think that has been partially covered in the discussion, but perhaps you could reflect on those two questions and any other questions now, Alexei, in terms of the politics and the strategic questions. There was also a question. I mean, I've been appalled by the suggestion that Ukraine should give up all of its critical minerals to the United States as some sort of payment to the United States. Perhaps that's another question that you could touch on. Alexei, back to you. I'm just watching the time. These webinars always gallop once we get going, and we're down to the last 15 minutes or so. But take those questions, and participants, I'm still keeping an eye on your questions and trying where I can to get them answered. Alexei.
Thank you, Mark. I'm trying to be as brief as possible. Whatever Putin says, he's a professional liar. And he's just because he's a professional, the KGB. And KGB officers been trained to lie professionally. So it's just a matter of professional skills. But now he's also a liar as a politician. 4% of Zelensky, numerous public opinion polls in Ukraine show that the level of trust or support for Zelensky, as not as a person, but as an institution, as a president of Ukraine, is above 50%. It doesn't mean that in case of elections, 50% or more of Ukrainians will vote for Zelensky. It's just a matter of the current situation. He is a legitimate president. He is in charge of Ukrainian defense, of Ukrainian future, and that's why people support him. So that's how we should understand it. But it's definitely nothing about 4%. He is not a dictator. He is already a second president elected after 2014 revolution, which Putin still calls a coup d'etat or whatever. But there were two democratic elections, two presidents that changed. They were changed in Ukraine. Fact checking, yes, there are many politicians who don't care about fact checking, and unfortunately, two world leaders now have this common feature that they don't need to bother themselves about the fact checking. Also, I will mention about this possible compromises territory, and what Irina and Annabelle actually said. If we talk about Ukrainian society readiness to accept compromises on Ukrainian territories, it is not about square kilometers. It's not about sea beaches or mineral resources and occupied territory. It's about people, because the life in occupation is horrible. There is a certain part of Ukrainians who feel quite comfortable on these territories. They have very basic needs in this life. They don't care about language or freedom of speech, etc. But the prevailing majority of Ukrainians suffer on the territories. Denazification, what Russians call denazification, actually means eliminating Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, any church except Russian church, and total Russification. Demilitarization, one of the objectives declared by Putin, actually means militarization, because this is the militarization of Ukrainian youth. And in Russia, they impose the same culture of militarization, even children in the kindergarten, where military uniform is used as a kind of a dress code. So it is not about compromise on territories. It's also not about, it's not accepting compromise of people being left by Ukrainian state on these territories under Russian occupation. Minerals, that's an excellent question, because that's probably one of the most striking developments as for me. And here it's much bigger problem. I could understand to some extent why President Trump is raising this issue about compensation, financial compensation for support provided by Ukraine. But he is critically wrong in such an approach, because here he gives or he communicates the message that this is purely Ukrainian war and purely Ukrainian business. And what the United States have invested to Ukraine so far has nothing to do with the American security interest or with the European global security interest. So it's simply a charity, was a charity. But again, from a moral point of view, if you donate a charity and then ask a person that in trouble to pay back, what kind of person you are? That's kind of, I mean, morality has very little place in international politics, but this is something I think is very, very, very important to keep in mind. And also coming back to your question about what our vision of peace and future Ukraine. When we talk about reconstruction of Ukraine or rebuilding Ukraine, we actually don't mean that we have to renovate what was destructed or destroyed by the war. We have very serious discussion, and not just discussion, but practical action about not building Ukraine, new Ukraine, Ukraine the future. Either we talk about economic infrastructure or we talk about social relationship. And also another part of this future vision of future peace and that justice, that the war crimes, what Irina mentioned, what Annabelle mentioned, should be punished. War criminals should not escape unpunished. And of course, reparation, that Russia has to pay for the damage it delivered.
Thank you very much, Alexei. Just staying with you just for one, and I want you to answer this question as quickly as possible, even though it's complex, but it's come up a couple of times. Gillian says, is negotiation with Russia, Brian May, sorry, Gillian, can Ukraine call Putin's bluff and declare neutrality with regard to NATO membership? And Cello asks a fairly similar question. What's your take from this narrative that this gruesome war started because Ukraine was advised not to sign a deal with Russia? Ukraine will not join NATO since the Russian government was concerned. Will you just say a little bit about NATO? Alexei, as briefly as possible. I wish we had the time. We don't, but there are a couple of other questions I want to round up with.
Ukraine cannot afford to declare neutrality because of geography, because of the history. If Ukraine could place itself on somewhere between Switzerland and Austria, then we could do this. So, and by the way, Ukraine was attacked in 2014 at the time when Ukraine was in fact a neutral country. There was no NATO membership ambition at that time, and Ukraine was attacked by Russia. At the time, it was neutral. So NATO membership is one of the options of NATO future security guarantees, but it's not the only option. And another important point that Ukraine has to change, it's written already in Ukrainian constitution as the strategic foreign policy objective. So in the time of war, Ukrainian legislation, again, forbids to change constitution. That's kind of legal issues and security issues and issues of Ukraine's vision of its future.
Thank you very much. So it's 18:53. I'm going to ask you all to perhaps these may be your final comments. We might come back one more time, but there's a bunch of questions. It started right at the beginning of the webinar with a question about how can the global community move beyond symbolic support to concrete actions that truly shift the balance in Ukraine's favor. And in a similar vein, there was a question just a few minutes ago saying, after the recent Munich Security Conference, which clearly shifted in the US policy, which clearly revealed a shift in US policy of the Trump administration, what action would Ukraine want from the EU? And I would add that to that question to all three of you, what action do you want from Africa and South Africa I believe our president has invited your president to visit South Africa sometime soon. So my last question to each of you is, what can the world do? We've heard your voices to support this struggle of the people of Ukraine for self-determination and freedom and human rights, starting with Annabelle and then Irina and then Alexei.
Yeah, I guess I partly said some of this before about being very specific in terms of choosing responsibility over the inaction generally. And also, this implies voicing the topic of Ukraine constantly, having discussions, communicate about that, going to the streets and manifesting, understanding how your local connection with government work. Can you impact your government? How can you impact your government decisions? If your government is democratic, they will listen. So this is important to understand from this perspective, that it matters, that people constantly speak about that matters, because this is something that opposes the narratives that both right now are like present in media, coming both from Trump and from Russia. And we also, from the Ukrainian Institute perspective, the institution that works with cultural diplomacy, we really invite countries and people be curious about other countries' cultures, because personal engagement in the contact makes it clearer why. And a lot of these questions are taken away when we have this personal contact, when we care for people in a personal way. And that starts with interacting a little bit more with culture, with literature, with music. So I invite you to actually get to know Ukrainian culture, as right now one of the tasks that we also put for ourselves is to learn more about South African cultures, about other cultures we rarely didn't have possibility to learn about. So this kind of exchange is something that we can unite forces in terms of like prevail, like to fight this narratives that exist. And the last, but I guess not the least, is that we can all work together after we win this war to actually use everything we learned to stabilize the other problems we had. Like in the beginning, Mark, you mentioned that we have actually a very big problem in our world about ecology, that this war is even putting it worse because it's an ecocide in Ukraine. And the way we deal with it, the way we learn how to deal with it, is something we can share with the world to understand how do we all together deal with stuff like that. Diversity, multiculturalism, so injustice, everything that are human problems are Ukrainian problems right now. So we are ready to share the knowledge with those who really want to engage. Thank you.
Thank you, Annabelle. Very, very powerfully put. Be curious, and it matters, and everything that are human problems are Ukrainian problems. Irina.
I will build what Annabelle just said, because that's very much echoes what I would like to say as well. But I will start with the important thing to mention, that there is no small support. Every support matters and means a lot for us. Please do not forget about that. And I will put 3 points here that how the support could be provided to be not symbolic but meaningfully. The first I would say is tell our stories. That goes with, again, Mark, your question on disinformation. When you hear some doubt that not Russia is aggressor, just convince those who are thinking that way through telling our stories. You have just heard those from us, and many others can be heard on in national and international platforms. Another way that I assume could be meaningful is organize an event and invite Ukrainians. Whatever you can do. You can do the exhibition or some discussion or some movie night or some meeting at your home and invite Ukrainians and provide the platform to share our stories. That would be huge support, really huge support for us. And the last but not least is tell about your experience for us. That especially goes to South Africa. And I will maybe announce here that in about a few weeks, the delegation of 6 Ukrainian women will come to South Africa to learn from you. We represent different areas. Some of us are working in women political participation, women peace and security, transitional justice, memorialization and documenting war crimes, journalists, mental health specialists. Just we are going to you with the aim to know the pain of others, just to cope with ours. And if you share those stories with us, that would be such a valuable resource for us to understand how we could go through our challenges. And your knowledge, your experience is such a value for us. And we would like to cope together, to become stronger together, and to voice this injustice that is in different parts of the world, even though we are so far away from each other. But we would like to voice that injustice could be transformed into just and sustainable peace with the common efforts. Thank you.
Thank you also for very powerful words, and again reminding us that politics is all about people at the end of the day, and personal and human. And if we center politics on people and people's needs and people's capability for compassion and understanding of each other, and if we enable that, then we won't have this bloody mess that we have of war in many parts of the world and oppression. Alexei, it's over to you to have the final word for this evening.
Mark, I can't agree more with your words that people should be the most important. Now we see that we are in this situation when big powers believe that strong leaders can shape the world in their interest. And actually, we also witnessing a demolition of the rules-based system. And we all know that the United Nations, for instance, serves the best interest of the small nations. And that is the answer to your question, what countries like South Africa or other countries of the rest of the world should do. Because if we allow the big players to shape the world in how they want, I think that all of us are going to suffer. And to end up, I agree with previous speakers that any support is important. But if you can afford more than symbolic support, practical support, this is the right time to do. And staying on the Ukraine side, not is a charity. It's not a good gesture. It's the investment in your personal interest, in the investment in your national interest. And thank you. I will finish here.
Thank you very much, Alexei. 3 very powerful, I think, closing comments and statements, which, if the feelings you've set off in me are anything to go by, I think will move everybody who has strayed a little bit into overtime with us for the closing part of this webinar. So let me just say a few words and a few thank yous before we close. But first of all, to the three of you, Annabelle, Irina, Alexei, thank you very much for being with us this evening and for what you have been doing at home over the last years, and for your bravery and courage and commitment not only to Ukraine, but to the world and to the cause of justice and peace and freedom all over the world. We wish you peace and we wish you safety and love, and that there can be some just outcome from this horror before too long, before too many more people lose their lives and have their lives disrupted. We're very grateful to you for taking the time with us, and we hope that I know it will have been a worthwhile investment of your time, because I know that you will have motivated people. We haven't had much chance to talk about South Africa tonight, but I'm happy at least that South Africa took a position at the United Nations yesterday, very much in accord with what Alexei said about defending a rules-based order, international law, human rights, opposing aggression by one state against another state. So we're glad to be with you again on that point. I'd like to thank Zhavinka Katcher. I probably mispronounced the name, and I apologize for every mispronounced name. And maybe it's just part of nervousness, but who helped pull this together, set this up from within South Africa. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Nicole Williamson, who works always behind the scenes to make the Daily Maverick webinars a great success. So thank you, everybody. And I'd like to thank all of you who joined us this evening. This has been about the freedom of Ukrainian people and the freedom of Ukrainian voices. And we have created a space for 1 hour and 7 minutes to hear those voices. So good night, everybody. And thanks very much for being with us. Thank you. Bye-bye.